it's a really great analogy for like what older men experience later on in life, and we don't talk about it because we kind of like, oh, no, it's a dirty little secret that this changes. And I would argue a lot of that comes from the patriarchy, this idea that men are supposed to be stoic and strong and masculine.
Hello, everyone. I am Michelle Melville Kashan. I am the Community and Content Director here at Sexual Health Alliance. And today I'm with Dr. Christopher Wilson. Welcome. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Thank you for the welcome. So I have a PhD in human sexuality. I am a licensed marriage family therapist, a certified therapist and supervisor, and I have a practice in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. We're in downtown. And I have a cool team of clinicians who, everyone from interns to seasoned therapists, and we are all part of the LGBTQ community in some way. And so we all kind of try to work within our community as well. And sometimes that means working with LGBTQ populations, and other times we work with people who are not part of LGBTQ populations because we work with everyone.
Yeah, that's amazing. Well, I'm so happy to have you with us today. You're going to be speaking at our upcoming event happening this month. It's called Smart Love and Pride of Sides with Dr. Joe Court and other expert presenters like yourself. So your talk title is How the Patriarchy Negatively Impacts Men. So can you tell us a little bit about what you're going to be talking about?
Yeah, so the patriarchy negatively impacts men in a lot of different ways. And one of the biggest ways is like emotional intelligence and the ability to like actually express our emotions. And so the ability to actually not only connect with our emotions, which I think is a big struggle that a lot of men have, but it's also the ability to actually go ahead and disseminate this information out to other people, meaning like connect with them, share those emotions, and then feel like they can actually be received. I see a lot of times, particularly if I'm working with heterosexual couples, where a man will share his emotions after like finally digging in deep and connecting with it, share that with his partner or his wife, and a lot of times she'll shut him down on that. And part of that comes from the patriarchy, the message that we are not supposed to be able to share our emotions. And so women also internalize that a lot of times too, which is that, oh, men aren't supposed to have their own emotions. Nope, we're allowed to have our own emotions, and they might be different than what you experience. And that's totally okay, and that's valid.
Yeah. Oh, that's going to be such an interesting topic. So you work with men and marginalized communities. And what are some common relational patterns or myths that you find yourself helping your clients to unlearn?
There's so many. But I would say like part of it is like message around are a big part of that. Like the idea that men can say no to things, the idea that men might not always be in the mood, that our sexuality changes over time for most male-bodied people. Obviously, in this context, I'm talking more about cisgender men, but it also kind of holds true for trans men. And the reality is that, you know, as we age, our bodies start to not work the same way we used to. So there's this myth that men are always supposed to be able to ready and able to have. And the reality, particularly as we age, like that's just not as viable. We have a tendency in our culture to talk about sex, particularly male sexuality, from a really young male perspective, like the idea of like what teens and 20 somethings really experience. We don't typically talk a lot about men as we age. And when we do talk about it, it's almost always in the negative, or it's simplified. I
Yeah.
can remember like it was years ago, but I remember an SNL sketch from years ago when Viagra first came out, and it was like they were interviewing people on the street, like, "Do you need it? Do you need it?" And everyone kept like, "No, no, no." And it's like, well, no. Sometimes as you age, you do need it, and it's because our bodies are not working the same way they did 15, 20, 30 years ago. And it's an important message that, like, yep, it's not necessarily even about attraction to the person or desire. Sometimes it's a physiological issue, and sometimes it's a mental issue. As we were talking about emotions earlier, the idea
Yeah.
like emotions are connected to our sexuality, particularly for men, is really important because a lot of men, both men and women both, have this view that men are devoid of their emotional attachment when it comes to sex. And it's like, nope, that can be true, but it can also be true that emotions play very important role in sex and sexuality.
Yeah. Oh, and I think we're really doing everyone involved a disservice when we have that assumption that all men function like the same way as they did in their teens and their 20s. Because, you know, if their partners don't understand and they don't understand, and then we have this miscommunication happening. And I think that's where the education piece really comes in.
Oh, most certainly. And I do a lot of work in my own clinical work in doing education around these things and getting people to both understand whether they're male coupled or female male coupled. Um, this idea that like it's more complicated than what we think it sometimes is, and it's not always easy, and it's not always simple, and it's not always, oh, pretty person, erection happened. I think it's an important piece because like so many people, and I'm going to lean a little bit more into women in this instance. Like, I found a number of female clients, they feel so hurt when their male partners aren't able to get an erection super easily the way they did 10, 15 years earlier in the relationship. And they think it's something about them, like, oh, he doesn't find me attractive anymore. And sometimes that's the case, but more oftentimes than not, it's no, his body's changing, just as anyone else's body has changed. I always like to use the analogy, our eyes don't work the same way they did when we were 15, 16 years old. Why are
Right.
why are we expecting our pieces to work the same way? They don't. And it's such an important piece. Yeah.
Yeah. And people, I mean, as everyone in this profession knows, like sexual health is not talked about enough, and it just impacts every aspect of your life and your relationships. It's so important that we start talking more about these topics.
Oh, certainly. And it's funny, my husband and I were just watching the series Big Mouth, which is a great show on Netflix. If you haven't seen it,
Yeah.
people haven't seen it, they should watch it. It's so funny. But part of the series, I'm going to spoil it a little bit for folks, but the series did end recently. And part of the series ended when one of the characters stopped their pubertal process. And part of the show is talking about that as an ending point. And it was interesting because it does just give a small snippet about what it's like for a shifting male sexuality, particularly as we are, younger. And we, in their case, like they're talking about like a teen character, but like it's a really great analogy for like what older men experience later on in life. And we don't talk about it because we kind of like, oh, no, it's a dirty little secret that this changes. And I would argue a lot of that comes from the patriarchy, this idea that men are supposed to be stoic and strong and masculine. Even today, where we would arguably see younger men who are more apt to talk a little bit more openly than maybe previous generations, I would still say there's still a big issue for a lot of men to talk openly about sex and vulnerability and what they're needing from their partners.
Yeah. Oh, I totally agree. So, as someone with extensive experience working with LGBTQ clients and those in non monogamous relationships, what advice would you give clinicians trying to build more competence in these areas?
I think first and foremost that like be open to the fact that every relationship construct is different. Not all couples are going to have the same dynamics when it comes to open relationships. Some people want open as in like they have complete freedom to do whatever with whomever whenever they want. Some people want things like veto power. Some people want a more poly dynamic as opposed to an open relationship dynamic, and talking through kind of like what those differences are. Oftentimes when I am working with clients in the very beginning, I'm usually trying to assess like what kind of structure are they most interested in, and making sure that they have an understanding of what structural importance is and why it's important to have an understanding of what they're both wanting from an open or poly dynamic system. Because I've seen in my work couples who kind of jump in quickly into poly or open without really thinking through the actual emotional ramifications that can come from that, or thinking through, are they actually on the same page of the type of relationship they want? So I can think of a couple in particular that I'm thinking of where they both went into it saying that they wanted to have kitchen table poly. And when they actually started doing the process of opening up their relationship and having a poly relational system, they realized that for one half of that, it didn't actually work out. So in ideal, yes, it worked. It's what they thought they wanted. But in reality, they didn't actually do very well when they were really open and honest about what the dating relationships like were with the other person's partners. And they didn't necessarily want to connect with the other person's partners, what are known as metaphors. And they wanted to like just kind of know that the date happened and know that they were still loved and cared for. And that's really all I wanted to know. And so they were able to kind of figure out over time what worked well for them in terms of a construct.
Oh, that's such great advice, because everyone has a little bit of a different version or definition of like what they think they want their poly relationship to be. And one person might view kitchen table poly a little bit differently. One person might think they want that, and then when they start experiencing it, they're like, no, thanks. So I think that's good for clinicians to keep in mind. Like, always be fluid, always keep the communication going, because that's so important for your clients. So you hold both clinical and educational credentials. So how has your training as a health educator shaped your therapy practice? Like what can therapists learn from public health models of sexuality?
A great question. I would say ultimately, I really love the trans theoretical model, which I think a lot of people have used more and more in therapy. I would say like 15 years ago, probably people weren't really talking about it much, but it's this idea that like change happens over time. It's not something quick. And I think that's an important thing to understand and help clients understand ultimately and clinicians to understand, especially younger clinicians. I find that a lot of the younger clinicians really want change to happen immediately. And then it's like, well, no, you've got to recognize that your client's going to change at the pace that works for them. And sometimes that's not your pace,
Yeah.
and I can definitely, I can think every clinician can kind of think of some client that you're just like, I really can see why they need a change and they just aren't ready yet for that change. And that kind of painful at times, and trying to get yourself comfortable with the fact that that's going to be some discomfort that you're experiencing. And I think kind of learning that is really important. Um,
Yeah. And like we were talking about earlier, like that educational piece comes into the therapy room. Like you provide so much education.
yeah, I think I always say like the thing that the through line through all my jobs I've had, whether that is working as a milieu therapist or being an educator, like was a teacher, it's really educator. Like I was an educator, whether I was a milieu therapist working with kids in residential. I was an educator when I was teaching at the collegiate level. I was an educator when I was a personal trainer back in the day. Like
Yeah.
so education is the through line through everything I've done. And that includes the clinical work I do. A good chunk of what we do as a clinician is providing education and going beyond like basics of articles sometimes, and sometimes providing resources on education. One of the things I like to do for a lot of my couples is to give them a very simple article that's a couple pages that just goes over a couple response cycles that people can experience when they're looking at how they are interested in sex. And whether they're falling more in line along the lines of the Masters and Johnson model, which is the linear model, which is a relatively like, yep, some pretty simple model, and or going more complicated, like or probably bad word choice, more fully formed, I'll say, model, like the Bassan model.
Yeah. And I think, at our events, so our audience, we have sexual health educators, counselors, therapists, coaches, medical professionals. So you have all these different sexual health professionals attending our events because there is so much crossover. Like, I don't think we could ever have an event that's like, this event is only for educators and therapists won't find any value. Like there's just so much intertwining there.
Yeah, I'm a certified therapist, and part of that is being part of the American Association of Sexual Educators, Counselors, and Therapists. So that organization literally is about the intersection of educators, counselors, and therapists. And I think it's so important that we have people from various different types of jobs all represented in that work. I have some amazing colleagues that are educators. I have some amazing colleagues that are counselors who, when I need someone to do something that I can't do as a therapist based on like limits of ethics or legality, I will oftentimes rely on them because they can do different things that I can't. Sometimes we rely on people who are like sexual surrogates or sexual coaches to do more hands-on work because we are not allowed to do that as therapists. So the reality is like I have some great resources and great people that I connect with who can do those things. One of my colleagues in the Philadelphia area, Kyle Hoffman, does a lot of work with men and had like a lot of these really cool retreats on male body connection. And it's something I can't do as a therapist. And so having that resource in my pocket is really helpful to be like, hey, it sounds like you're really needing to have more one-on-one interactions with men and to be able to break some of the patriarchal messages. Let me give you over information on Kyle's workshops and what he does, because I think that would be really helpful for you.
Yeah. Oh, definitely. So, for professionals supporting clients who are navigating issues like sexual dysfunction, what shifts in language or attitude, even clinical approach, do you believe are most needed today?
I think going in with curiosity is probably one of the biggest things. Trying to not have a preconception of what someone's experience is. Making sure that we're treating everyone as an individual, I think, is so important. And I'm sure I'm guilty of not always doing that the best I would like to either. But just really understanding everyone's individual stories. One of the forms of therapy I practice is narrative therapy. And I think it's really important to really think through what is the narrative of this person's lived experience and how is that informed the presenting they're coming in with. What are those unique outcomes that the model calls it, that are those exceptions to the rule? And when they actually felt more confident, for instance, like if they're coming in because they're not feeling confident around their erectile functioning, for instance, like how can we build up a position of strength for them using that model to find those unique outcomes where they're like, yeah, I was in a really good place, whether that's because they had a really great erection or because they were able to let go of the fear of not having an erection and be able to just enjoy the pleasure. I'm really, really big on getting people to focus less and less on the orgasm and more on the other aspects of pleasure that can come from sex, and trying to get them to recognize like there is a value in that. Even if you don't get off, you can have a really great sexual experience with somebody just from the connection with them, or just because you got to explore new erogenous zones, or because you learned something new about yourself when it comes to sexuality. One of my favorite experiences, I had a client who is, I guess now in his 60s, but wasn't 50s at the time. And he and his wife were having some sexual concerns, and including some erectile issues. And he realized that after going through an exercise I gave them to explore erogenous zones, that he had an erogenous zone in his armpit. And this was new at, I think, 58, 59, somewhere in that pocket. And they had been together for almost, I think it was right around 30 years at that point. And they were just learning this. And it was a really cool moment of going, oh, that's a new part of my sexuality. And also it really helped for him when he would start to lose his erection. She could play with his armpit. His erection would return because it was a new area that he had developed in terms of an understanding of his body and what actually was his body cues and responses.
I love that so much. That is so valuable. Oh, that's great. And so your work centers on intimacy and relationships. And you're also a supervisor. And so you tend to blend humor and self-disclosure in your sessions. How do you teach other therapists or your supervisees to use those tools effectively without blurring boundaries or losing any therapeutic depth?
Well, I talk about what level of disclosure is and why are you disclosing that information, right? So are you doing it for your own self-serving reason, or are you doing it to create a better therapeutic relationship with your client? Are you doing it because you want to help the client understand that they're not alone? Or are you doing it to get some sort of validation need met for yourself as a therapist? I tend to use, obviously, clinical vignettes. I don't obviously provide details that would identify the client, but I give little pieces of, information about a previous case so that clients don't always feel like they're alone. And I make sure that particularly as interns or younger therapists are developing their skills, they're able to do more of those kind of examples as they have more experience. Also, we talk through when we're in supervision, oh, that was a self-disclosure you did. Let's talk about why you did that self-disclosure. What was the importance of it? How do you think the client received that? How did you feel about the self-disclosure? Because that can be important too. Sometimes we do a self-disclosure in a completely appropriate way. And then after we're like, ooh, was that a good decision? Did I make the right call on that one? I always say before we are ever therapists, we are human. And that means we are to make errors. And that means that, even a therapist, even seasoned therapist, we're going to make a mess up. It happens. We're not perfect. And, sometimes we're going to attribute something wrong, or we're going to say something that we maybe should have said differently. Oftentimes in my own sessions, I will sometimes pause myself and I'll tell my client, give me a second. I'm trying to think of the right phrasing I want to use right now. To basically slow myself down, and I encourage my supervisees to do the same thing. We can slow down our process and make sure that we're modeling that for our clients too, so they can slow down their own process when they're communicating with a significant other, for instance.
Yeah. It doesn't always have to be a performance. You're not expected to be this on expert all the time. It's okay to take a moment to pause and think about something or how you want to say it, and just make sure that you're doing it in your most authentic way. All right. So would you like to leave us with one piece of advice, takeaway, tip for our counselors, educators, coaches, therapists, how they can better serve LGBTQ plus populations?
I would say two things really. One is to recognize that men are socially conditioned under a lot of restrictions, and I think it's important to kind of acknowledge those restrictions. And at the same time, also acknowledge that every male person is a different individual and they're not always going to have the exact same lived experience. I like to talk about it as being socialized male and socialized female, not necessarily regarding our actual assigned gender per se, but more so in like how were you brought up. So I had a guy I worked with who was part of a male female couple, and in many ways he was socialized female because he lived in an all female household. All the people around him were predominantly female. His lived experience wasn't really having many males in his life, and so he had a lot of hesitancy about initiating intimacy with his wife, and she really just wanted him to push hard for intimacy. And it was
Yeah.
a really hard thing for them both to get comfortable with. He had to learn how to, like, for her purposes, I'll be very contextual in that, to push past her initial resistance because that's what she wanted. She wanted him to like show that he really wanted her and desired her. And so
Yeah.
he had to learn how to push past that resistance. And she had to learn how to be assertive when she really didn't want it. Like to be able to communicate, like, this isn't me just saying no for like a coquettish, like fun way of playing around with it. No, it's a true no for me right now. And
Yeah.
they had to learn how to communicate that and play around with that so that it still helped, like it fueled their passion, but also that it was able to like make sure that it was appropriate and boundaries were being held and that they both felt comfortable with that.
Oh, that's such a great tip. Thank you. All right, for all of you, if you'd like to hear more from Dr. Christopher Wilson, you can attend our online event happening June 21st and 22nd, Smart Love and Pride of Sides. It's an online event. It's very accessible. You can get tickets on our website at sexualhealthalliance.com. There'll also be a link in the description below. Well, thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
All right, bye everyone. We hope you enjoyed this interview with Dr. Christopher Wilson. If you love sexual health education, please subscribe to our channel and like this video. If you enroll as a student with Sexual Health Alliance, you could get this weekend event for free. So email us for more information. And do us a favor, share this with someone who might benefit from this information. Your support helps us reach more people with important sexual health information. So if you're passionate about this space, we know you'll enjoy these videos, so check them out. And remember, you are exceptional.